Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's launch of Africa's Pulse, the World Bank's biannual economic update for Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm Anne-Marie Dias Borges, a senior journalist and anchor with a passion for African news. As COVID-19 continues to spread across the world, with the number of cases surpassing 30 million globally and with more than 980,000 deaths worldwide, the latest Africa's Pulse looks at the impact of the pandemic on African economies. The continent seems to have escaped the worst of the pandemic, but this crisis has taken such a large toll on economic activities across Africa, forever changing millions of lives in the region. So today we ask, how badly is Africa affected, and what is the road to recovery? And to discuss today, I'm joined by Albert Zeufack, Chief Economist for Africa at the World Bank. Welcome, Albert.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie.
And please note, ladies and gentlemen, that we have been taking notes of your questions and comments prior to this event. So feel free to carry on discussing and commenting using this hashtag Africa's Pulse. So, Albert, I want to start by asking you, what are the key findings of this report?
Anne-Marie, there are three important findings of this report. The first is that the global pandemic, COVID-19, has taken a very, very large toll on African economies and is threatening to erase a decade of hard-won economic progress on the continent. We are projecting that economic activity in Sub-Saharan Africa will contract by 3.3% in 2020. And this is confirming our projections like last April that the continent would go into its first recession in 25 years. Second finding, Anne-Marie, we realize clearly that the road to recovery will unfortunately be long, maybe steep, but must be paved with sound economic policies. Countries would have to be implementing short-term measures to replenish the fiscal space that is needed for investment, but also long-term measures that would allow countries to create the jobs that the populations desperately need. The third finding of this report, Anne-Marie, is that fortunately, some African countries are seizing the opportunity of this COVID crisis to accelerate those structural reforms and really boost the momentum of reforms in many areas.
So we'll actually be addressing some of these opportunities a little bit later on in our discussion. But Albert, you mentioned that the road to recovery is going to be steep, is going to be long. Why is that? What are the biggest challenges?
Anne-Marie, before I get into the challenges, I want to make sure we clarify that although Africa has not been hit as hard as people had anticipated on the health front, COVID-19 is not over yet, and countries should not let their guard down. I think this is very important because in a number of countries, the reopening could lead to believe that COVID is over. It's not over yet. Now, when we say the road to recovery will be long and steep, what do we mean? What is clear from our report is that we'll have a sharp contraction in economic activity. If you take it in terms of GDP per capita, we will have a decline of close to 6% in 2020. That's the deepest we have seen. And by 2021, GDP per capita would have regressed to the level of where it was in 2007. That's 13 years of progress completely erased. So that's how deep that is. Second, and that's a serious challenge. Entering the crisis, African countries were already facing weak institutions and degrading quality of governance. That certainly would make it more difficult to catch up and launch the kind of recovery that is needed. Third, number of African countries, and most of them, in fact, will emerge from the crisis with deeper fiscal deficits and heavier debt burdens. The fiscal deficit is likely to increase by an average of 3.5 percentage points across the continent, and debt is likely to reach 67% in 2021, coming very, very close to the threshold of 70% that make it extremely dangerous.
You mentioned the debt issue in Africa. We know that the continent already had a massive debt problem before COVID. So is it now a looming crisis?
Anne-Marie, what is clear is that coming to COVID-19, African countries have increased their level of debt quite significantly. And the changing composition of debt has made that debt likely unsustainable as it has become more expensive to borrow. And that is certainly a very, very important area where African countries need to focus, increasing debt transparency, but also debt management in a way that prevents us from getting into that same trajectory again.
So you've mentioned never seen before economic impact, but I speak every day to people on the continent for whom business is pretty much going on as usual. We have a number of countries on the continent getting ready for election, campaigns are going on. There is a feeling in certain countries that the severity of the virus is fading out. How is that consistent with your findings?
That's absolutely consistent. And we need to acknowledge that, the low impact of COVID from the health perspective on Sub-Saharan Africa is partly due to the good policy response that a number of African countries have staged. Countries like South Africa, countries like Rwanda, Nigeria have actually listened to science and really practiced social distancing, lockdowns, and really implemented the recommendations of Africa CDC and have therefore managed to curb the progression of the virus that is stabilizing in a number of African countries. So that's important to acknowledge. Now, that has therefore led to a contraction of activity and a reduction in economic growth, which we have just discussed. So it's actually consistent with these findings. But more importantly, I think the point here is to realize that there's still quite a lot of uncertainty about COVID itself and its impact. On COVID itself, we're seeing the second waves in Europe, in the US, and there is still some possibility of second waves coming to Africa as country reopen and international travel resumes. So it is important to keep our guard up. It is important to continue strengthening our public health systems and continue to work with local communities to prevent COVID from spreading again.
Mm-hmm. So talking about different regions of the world, is Africa dependent on recoveries, let's say in Europe or in America? I can take the example of Guinea, for instance, who sits on huge amounts of iron ore. There isn't so much of a COVID crisis going on at the moment in Guinea, but there is in the countries that buy that iron from Guinea. So what do you say to that?
Well, it's absolutely the case that the COVID global pandemic came with a contraction in global trade. It was almost a sudden stop in global trade. it also led to a recession in the world. More than 90% of countries in the world are entering in a recession in 2020, which means that the demand for African products, demand for gold, demands for minerals that are used in Asia and in the US or Europe, that demand has declined. And with that contraction, the exports from African countries would also suffer. And we have seen that. So Africans' recovery depends on global recovery as well. And as these countries suffer, there will be repercussions on our recovery. And that's why we believe the road to recovery will be long, because beyond commodities that we export to these countries, a number of African countries receive huge remittances from their diaspora working in these countries. 6 African countries have remittances accounting for more than 10% of their GDP. Then you have tourism. Island nations such as Cape Verde, such as the Seychelles, Mauritius, are counting on tourism from all these other parts of the world for their growth. So with the contraction and the recession going on around the world, this will clearly affect the speed at which African economies can recover.
That's very interesting, actually. I was talking to the Minister of Tourism of Cabo Verde very recently, and he explained to me how impacted that island nation has been due to the lack of tourists. On some of the islands, 90% of the population works in tourism, direct and indirect. So thank you very much for pointing that out. So obviously, we want Africa back on that road to recovery as fast as possible, but we also want it to stay standing once it's recovered. So in concrete terms, Albert, what should African countries do to get back on their feet?
Anne-Marie, there are 3 important things African countries need to do. The first is implementing short-term policies to reconstitute the fiscal space that was lost because of COVID. And these policies include not only pursuing debt restructuring or debt renegotiation, or participating in initiatives such as the debt service suspension initiatives, the DSSI, which is piloted by the World Bank and the IMF. But it's also about implementing serious reforms to increase the efficiency of our public spending, stemming illicit financial flows that actually could avail those resources to African development, curbing corruption, fighting corruption effectively to allow African resources to be devoted to its development. These are all extremely important policy reforms that need to be implemented now. But ultimately, Anne-Marie, a sustained recovery, an inclusive recovery, would have to be built on policies that lead to job creation. And those policies, from our perspective, are categorized in 3 groups. One is investing in the digital economy. If there is one silver lining from this crisis, is that the digital economy and the digital revolution is not a luxury for Africa. So investing not only in infrastructure, but also in the regulatory framework that would allow our countries to close the digital gap with the rest of the world, but also close the digital gap within countries between urban cities and urban areas and rural areas. That's one. Second area of reform is the move towards reallocating our resources to effectively adding value to our natural resources and moving into value additions and regional value chains. This is extremely important because that's the process that leads to the creation of jobs, and the current model of our economies, which is basically exporting raw materials, does not create jobs. Not enough for the youth, not enough for women. This is so important that our economies implement reforms that would change the structure of our economies towards more value addition and integration into regional and later on global value chains. And the third area of reform is what we call the spatial integration, which is increasing productivity of agriculture in our country by better integrating, by better connecting urban areas and rural areas. That is what would allow our cities to be more efficient and become truly the cradle of job creation and innovation. Those spatial integration policies should also be about ensuring that we create the conditions for activity in our countries to locate in the most efficient places and therefore increase productivity across the board.
So are African governments doing enough? You've touched on corruption a few minutes ago, and there have indeed been reports into the use of COVID relief funds in South Africa, in Kenya, for instance, which reveal potential frauds.
Well, there are clear, needs for reforms in the governance, in improving governance across African countries, and our reports on country policy and institutional assessment points to a degradation of the situation when it comes to efficiency of public administrations and accountability and corruption. So it is clear that countries need to tackle head-on the issue of corruption, and countries need to strengthen the systems for managing those resources, but also show leadership at the highest level in ensuring transparency and accountability.
Mm-hmm. And what about the international community? Is it doing enough, according to you, to help?
The international community has a big role to play. And there are three reasons for why they should do so. First reason, no African country can actually handle this crisis alone. The magnitude of this crisis is such that our limited fiscal space would not allow us to fight the health pandemic, fight the economic crisis that is ensuing, and potentially, food crisis that may be aggravated by, fragility and climate change. This is all extremely heavy for Africa, and it's going to be difficult for every single country in Africa to be able to face all these combined crises alone. So the support from the international community is essential. And this can come in the form of debt relief, and the process is already going on for public debt, but also it is important for the private sector to get involved and work towards improving the debt profile of African countries. So that's one. The second reason is that the international community can actually, more than debt or more than debt relief, focus on investing, bringing foreign direct investment, partnering with local African enterprises to start generating jobs in African economies. Africa needs more investment and jobs than debt. The two may be linked, but I think the focus probably is just a little bit too much on debt, and we need to really work with the international community to create jobs in Africa. That is certainly the way that would lead to a more sustainable and inclusive recovery, because just growth alone, it's not enough. Growth alone, and we have seen it in the past 10 years, where a number of African countries have been experiencing growth rate of more than 5 to 7%, yet poverty has not declined significantly. And this is because we are not creating enough jobs. So the international community can actually help us creating more jobs by catalyzing more investment into our countries. And the third reason why the international community should help and can do more is because investing in Africa is a public good, is a global public good. Africa is basically the place where by 2050 would have the largest number of young people on earth, and they represent the workforce, the global workforce that could actually power global growth, especially in a digital world where they may not need to move to contribute to GDP in other countries. So it is important for the international community to invest in human capital, to invest in infrastructure in Africa, to allow African economies to prosper as a global public good.
Mm-hmm. This seems like the perfect time, Albert, to look at the opportunities. You mentioned them very early on in our conversation. So are there any opportunities for African countries to seize right now in order for them to come back, not only come back, but come back stronger?
What is absolutely clear is that African countries are seizing the opportunity of COVID-19 to accelerate structural reforms. Countries like South Africa have embarked on a reform of the electricity sector, long awaited. Countries like Ethiopia are embarking on reforms of the telecom sector, long awaited. Countries like Nigeria are reforming energy subsidies, long awaited. So countries, these are just few examples across Africa. They are seizing the opportunity of this crisis to do the reforms that may help propelling these economies into different levels in the future. So that's clearly an important point to highlight. The second extremely important opportunity that African countries are seizing is the digital economy. The digital revolution is clearly, emerging from this crisis as a silver lining. African countries like Kenya, Rwanda, Nigeria have clearly seized that opportunity to improve access to the digital economy for their populations. They have seized those opportunities to improve their social protection programs using cash transfers, electronic cash transfers, to assist the population during COVID. We have seen countries in Africa really leveraging the digital to improve the way government functions. Ethiopia is now introducing electronic signature for all government procedures. Countries like Togo are setting up a mechanism for social assistance with the people that are revolutionary. So countries are seizing those opportunities, and the digital economy, which basically is not just about device, it's about a cross-cutting enabler for productivity, because we're seeing the digital powering productivity in agriculture, where tractors can actually be connected to the digital sphere and get testing of the soil. We are seeing farmers using telephones to receive information on weather or receive information on prices across markets, and therefore increasing their income. We're seeing the digital being leveraged across the economy in Africa to not only create new jobs, but improving the productivity of existing jobs. We're seeing the digital in education. And in a number of African cities, children are also now getting online and interacting and learning online. And this hopefully can prevent the risk of losing human capital that is looming with COVID, because COVID has clearly been a threat on human capital. With the closing of schools, a number of children may not return, especially girls, and that's really, that's terrible. So the digital is certainly being one of the most important opportunities our countries are seizing.
Mm-hmm. So looking ahead, Albert, and based on your study, what are your final recommendations?
Anne-Marie, if there is one important recommendation of this study, is to say the road to recovery must be paved with sound economic policies, especially those that lead to job creation, because ultimately that's what would make our recovery sustainable and inclusive.
Thank you very much, Albert. Albert Zeufack, the World Bank's Chief Economist for Africa. Thank you to every single one of you who tuned in today. Feel free to share, comment, and post using the hashtag #AfricasPulse. And if you want to learn more about the World Bank's response to the COVID crisis, visit worldbank.org/coronavirus. And to know more about what the World Bank does specifically in the African region and for African countries, then go to worldbank.org/Africa. You'll be able to read there all the latest Africa's Pulse reports, including the one that we discussed today. That's all for me. I'm Anne-Marie Dias Borges, and have a good day.